Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new-ish Mountain Goats record, Jenny from Thebes. Yes, I know this album came out in October, and it is now December. Do I care? No. Ask the average music nerd for a band or artist that has just about as much lore as, say, Star Wars or Warhammer, and chances are the Mountain Goats are gonna be one of the first names that come up. I mean, they may very well be the most beloved solo indie folk project turned full band of all time. An admittedly niche category, but one that John Darnielle and company still dominate all the same. As such, the John Darnielle-led project has become the kind of band that has a fan base that's not only rabid and willing to listen over and over to every single project that the band puts out, myself included among that fan base, but also the kind of fan base that has to practically hit the books every time they come out with another record that even slightly relates to a longtime character that was mentioned in an album, say, 5 to 10 years ago. And you know what? Putting out nearly 30 albums over the course of your career, that tends to add some depth to things. So, I get it. I digress. Jenny from Thebes is the Mountain Goats tracing their steps back to one of the most iconic characters throughout the history of their existence, while at the same time evolving musically and sonically in a way that I overall think is very successful. If you really want to have all of the necessary context to fully appreciate Jenny from Thebes, though, you need to go a little bit back. And by a little bit back, I mean over 20 years ago, which is, I guess, more than a little bit now that I think about it. The story of Jenny from Thebes really began in 2002 through the Mountain Goats' record All Hail West Texas, an album that is arguably their most beloved and a major turning point in the entire project's history. After all, it was the final album of John Darnielle's original run as a solo, lo-fi Panasonic boombox using singer-songwriter before he released Tallahassee in that same year, the first time the Mountain Goats were a full band rather than just him and a guitar. More importantly than that, however, All Hail West Texas introduced some of the most beloved songs and characters throughout the entirety of the Mountain Goats discography, and again, this is a group with a serious cult fan base, so saying that one record and a handful of songs from said record are among their most beloved, that's some serious business there. I mean, excluding the Sunset Trees This Year and Tallahassee's No Children, there's an argument to be made that the most well-loved and iconic Mountain Goats song is the best ever death metal band in Denton, from All Hail West Texas, and even beyond that, you have tracks like Distant Stations and Fault Lines that are easily found to be some of the most highly quoted and highly regarded songs that John Darnielle has ever written throughout the course of his lengthy career. And despite so many highly loved songs coming from that album in particular, at least within the context of the Mountain Goat fan base, I will say that despite there being so many highlights on that record, it's very hard to ignore a fairly quaint yet emotionally striking track on that album called Jenny. Despite being a very simple song, even in the context of John Darnielle, who has been known to do fairly minimalistic storytelling at times, it's a beautiful track about a narrator describing a girl named Jenny in a very romantic manner who rides a black and yellow Kawasaki bike, and that's pretty much all we know about her. We don't really get a lot of information, but it's a damn good song, okay? The point is that in a very subtle manner, admittedly, Jenny is a character who has staked herself in Darnielle's lore over the years, whether intentionally or not. I mean, sure, her appearances in Mountain Goats records are fairly few and far between, all things considered, but she does nonetheless pop up in very low-key ways throughout records like 2012's Transcendental Youth. Albums that were solid decades apart, yet nonetheless, she is still a figure that is being presented in relatively similar light to that she was painted in the first place, a very romantic, albeit slightly melancholic manner. Jenny from Thebes, however, as you may have guessed by her name being in the title, takes the prominence of a fairly underdeveloped yet well-liked character to an entirely new level by basically filling in the gaps of her story, at least for the most part. I mean, the entirety of the record is centered around the character of Jenny and the West Texas town that she's from. Can you believe that she's from a West Texas town? It's almost like she was introduced on a record called All Hail West Texas. This is something described by the band themselves as, quote, a story about the individual and society, about safety and shelter and those who choose to provide care when nobody else will. And I think that gives you a pretty good idea of how this record is portrayed. Not one of hope or devastation in particular, but rather one of just general observation through the lens of the story of a character who doesn't have a particularly fantastic life going on. Jenny from Thebes certainly does succeed in developing the character of Jenny as a whole, and that's something that I am admittedly a little bit surprised by. I mean, I didn't expect this album to be weak in terms of storytelling, but as I've stated before, Jenny as a character has always been a bit intentionally underdeveloped for the sake of providing this somewhat abstract mystique that Darnielle often approaches from a first-person perspective, from his own perspective to be particular. So it's a bit odd, yet very well executed overall to see Jenny as a character developed in a different way, because a major way that she is fleshed out is through the method of storytelling here. Most of the time when she's been presented as a character in the past, it's been from the first-person perspective of either Darnielle himself or some sort of other character that is not Jenny, just discussing their viewpoint on her. Whereas here, most of Jenny from Thebes is presented in a second-person narrative style, meaning that we get a much deeper look into Jenny herself, as well as her actions, and a bit of why she chooses to do them in the first place. I mean, we seriously get a nice, deep look into her personality, the world that surrounds her, as well as how she views that world, and the general state of mind that she's in throughout the many events that I will discuss as this review goes on. And as a whole, I have to say I wasn't really expecting the level of detail that goes into this record, considering the past examples of Jenny's appearances within the Mountain Goats discography. That being said, I am certainly not unpleasantly surprised. It's done really well, and it's really nice to see a different approach for a character that is arguably one of the most iconic within the entirety of Darnielle's history as a songwriter. Even still, many of these narrative choices are still intentionally limited in scope, allowing that aforementioned mystique from prior appearances of Jenny's to still very much be in play throughout the entirety of Jenny from Thebes. It's just that it's presented in a slightly different manner. For example, you have songs like Fresh Tattoo, for example, that have a lot of bits of symbolism and very much poetry-driven lyrical style that ultimately results in songs that allow the listener to properly understand the feelings and overall emotions that Jenny is going through, while at the same time very much being distanced from her, not really being in the thick of her own turmoil in her personal life, but at the same time getting a nice, almost more poetic yet still slightly scientific idea of how she is feeling. The aforementioned track, Fresh Tattoo, has lyrics like, "You may forget the whys and wheres of an old tattoo on your forearm there, but usually you recall the day you got one, and usually it fades in the sun, but not this one," very much meditating on the idea of permanence of one's own actions, while nonetheless kind of having this hazy sort of feeling about it. It's definitely a track that feels very much limited in an intentional manner, and I think the record's better for it. I think that if the album was too heavy-handed or tried a bit too hard to really go in on Jenny herself rather than what she does and what she thinks, that it would have felt significantly more flat. The objective choice to just look at Jenny from a distance, almost making the listeners more spectators than anything else, I think it was a great creative decision overall. Only 2 tracks later, on the track Murder at the 18th Street Garage, we get arguably some of the most intense and violent storytelling throughout the entirety of Jenny from Thebes, as Jenny murders the mayor of her town, and that's not metaphor, she literally kills the guy brutally at that. And you know what? Good for her. It's empowerment. You know, sometimes we go through things and the only way that you can really feel better is by murdering political officials. So yeah, I respect that. After a series of tracks discussing everything from the philosophical notion of the cycle of rebirth / self-repurposing to the body of the mayor literally floating in the town water tower, we finally end things off on the track Great Pirates, which really instills this sense of false hope for a better future. I mean, the listener has heard that everything Jenny has gone through and done, from living in a slightly ramshackle town to committing murder. That's a pretty serious one, and because of that, the listener does know, at least to an extent, that life will most likely continue throwing struggle after struggle at her in some way or another. Yet at the same time, there is this slight glimmer of hope throughout Great Pirates that just maybe everything will be okay, even if it does feel like she's sort of riding off into the distance of a mirage, not particularly anything real. It's a great track to end things off on, as it feels self-assured yet melancholic at the same time, and in the end, that's how you could describe the vast majority of Jenny from Thebes as an album. A record that is extremely confident in what it's saying and doing, yet at the same time recognizes that most of what goes on in this record is far from being on the sunny side of things. That isn't even to mention how much that Jenny from Thebes directly intertwines with the previously mentioned 2002 classic All Hail West Texas. I mean, nearly every cut off of this album has at least a slight reference to that record specifically. Not anything else within the Mountain Goats catalog, just All Hail West Texas, at least as far as I'm concerned. Maybe I missed something, who knows? I don't have enough time to study the lore, okay? I can't read the, I'm sure, several thousand-page John Darnielle history book of every character he's ever written about in his own weird Dylan-esque kind of way. Okay, so cut me some slack here, alright? In all seriousness, though, this record does provide a lot of callbacks to All Hail West Texas, but they are all woven into the record in a very natural way. It doesn't ever feel like Darnielle and company going, come on, you remember this song from the album you like? It never feels like that. It all comes across as natural, and ultimately it builds a very real world. It's successful Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master levels of world building coming from John Darnielle, and it is highly impressive. I mean, Cleaning Crew acts as Jenny's response to the narrator of Source Decay from the aforementioned All Hail West Texas. Meanwhile, you have tracks like Only One Way and Same as Cash, making these very cryptic and obscured references to songs like Distant Stations and Fall of the Star High School Running Back. In fact, they're references so cryptic and obscured that I almost hesitate to truly call them references, but at the same time, I really do feel like much of this record is, in one way or another, be it tonally or literally, related to All Hail West Texas, and it's done in a way that never feels like nostalgia bait for an indie folk classic from 20 plus years ago. It all feels very much real, it all feels very much natural, and above all else, it just continues to add to the atmosphere of the story if you are someone that's familiarized with the Mountain Goats' body of work, or at least one particular record from it. Now, I will be the first to admit that Jenny from Thebes is at least somewhat tethered to certain corners of the Mountain Goats' discography, and by certain corners, I mean specifically All Hail West Texas. I don't necessarily think I can with a whole heart say that you'll be able to totally get into this one if you aren't familiar with the context of that prior record from the band, but at the same time, if you do have that kind of context and you are passionate about that story and a lot of the minimalistic yet still highly realistic storytelling going on within All Hail West Texas, I think Jenny from Thebes is a highly successful reinterpretation of a lot of the ideas on there, as well as a heavy expansion of many of the different characters and events presented there. So, yeah, unless you're really into the musical stylings found throughout this record, and you just really dig it in some way or another, I think that the main people that'll come to appreciate this are going to be the big-time Mountain Goats fanatics like myself, but nonetheless, I still highly recommend it for a variety of reasons. Just mainly one of the big ones happens to be related to, previous Mountain Goats albums. And hey, Jenny from Thebes may be a lyric-focused album by a long shot at that, but nonetheless, that does not mean there is nothing to write home about from an instrumental standpoint. In fact, I would argue that some of the best instrumentals from the Mountain Goats in a while are found here on this record. Some of the best compositional work we've gotten from them since Goths, maybe. The record very largely embraces plenty of soft rock and yacht rock adjacent tendencies, but it never feels overly sappy in that way either. This is not Michael McDonald era Doobie Brothers. It's way better than that, actually. This album is just track after track of smooth, lush instrumentals that find themselves really carving out a new, unique sound for the Mountain Goats, a band that seemingly is always changing sonically and aesthetically. And while some may be put off by the horn and string arrangements provided by individuals like Karen Galvin and Matt Douglas, they are nonetheless absolutely essential to the sort of romantic punch that much of Jenny from Thebes carries. In fact, a lot of those extra embellishments that we see from the strings and brass are largely what bring the previously mentioned happy and somewhat hopeful, yet nonetheless very mournful and melancholic style that's found throughout the vast majority of this record. I don't necessarily think that some of those more bittersweet tones would be possible without sounds like that, even if it's something that does, again, put off some people potentially. The most energetic tracks here have a certain casual bite to them, more like a nibble, really, and that really defines the immediacy of some of the more climactic tracks like the aforementioned Murder at the 18th Street Garage. Meanwhile, there are more mellow and gentle instrumental tones on tracks like Ground Level and From the Nebraska Plant that heavily highlight some of the themes of clinging to ideas that are hopeless or non-existent, or clinging to concepts and relationships and places that are seemingly falling apart, both literally and figuratively. And as a whole, I think that the sonic palette found here is varied enough to feel unique from track to track, but nonetheless consistent enough to allow for a very successful overall listening experience, as the general mood of the record is conveyed pretty non-stop throughout the entirety of its runtime, while again still maintaining enough variation from song to song to continuously feel engaging. Jenny and the variety of characters within Jenny from Thebes are all living incredibly directionless lives, and the results of that range from committing a murder to being the victim of said crime. And as a whole, the more carefree vibes that are presented here instrumentally very much highlight those wistful kind of ideas, not really enhancing the more violent moments throughout this record emotionally and literally, but at the same time, they are complementary to the overall tones of, again, melancholy and directionlessness that come with a lot of the lyrical themes on this album. As a whole, I do think that a large amount of the appeal for this record is at least somewhat exclusive to the Mountain Goats fanbase, or at the very least people who are aware of Jenny as a character, specifically the All Hail West Texas and Transcendental Youth records. That being said, I do think that there is enough strong material here that even if you don't have that lore context, you can still go into this record finding a lot of enjoyment in it, and I really highly recommend it if you are new to the Mountain Goats as a band. I mean, sure, it doesn't sum up their entire career in terms of style or anything like that, but if you really want a good example of where they are now musically, I mean, there's nothing better that you can choose than their latest record, right? I mean, that just kind of makes sense. I think this is a very approachable record for newcomers, and I also think that this is a very deep and well-executed record for those who are veterans of the entire fandom surrounding John Darnielle and the Mountain Goats. So, no matter which end of the spectrum you're coming from, I think that Jenny from Thebes is a great record. With all of that in mind, it almost seems like the intent of Jenny from Thebes as an album is to not really appeal to anybody. In fact, I would say that the overall point of this record, at least one of the many points that's trying to make, is that a story is never over until the author really says it is. I mean, this is a character that was introduced 20 plus years ago that hasn't even been mentioned in a Mountain Goat song, at least not by name, in literal years at this point, yet here we are with a full record that really heavily fleshes out her story, and even through all of that, it never really feels like there is a conclusive end to this record, and that's undeniably intentional. So I would say that don't really be surprised if Jenny continues to show up in Mountain Goat's works in the future. On the track Same as Cash, John Darnielle states, "I can only see the scene secondhand," and that's something that is absolutely reflected within the listener. No one can truly understand the entire depth of the story besides John Darnielle himself, and he has no obligation to reveal every single minute detail that has anything to do with Jenny as a character or the world that surrounds her. And you know what? We may only be able to understand the story of Jenny from a perspective that is not totally hers, but the tale of a woman, her directionless life in a directionless town, her crime, and her Kawasaki motorcycle that has still stuck around after all these years is something that remains just as striking today as it was when it was first introduced well over 20 years ago at this point. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.